The world first tilted on its axis when I was 17. It wasn't a literal tilting, of course, not like the Earth suddenly lurching in space. It was a personal cataclysm, a subtle but seismic shift in my own reality. Before that day, life had been a relatively smooth, predictable road. There were bumps, sure, the usual teenage dramas and anxieties, but nothing that felt fundamentally destabilizing. I had a sense of control, a belief in the reliability of my own body and mind. I trusted that I could navigate the world with a certain degree of competence and grace. That day, however, that illusion shattered. The ground beneath my feet became unsteady, and I realized with a chilling certainty that things would never be quite the same again. The axis of my world had shifted, throwing everything off balance. It started as an ordinary day, indistinguishable from any other. The sun was shining, birds were singing, metaphorically at least. I don't recall any actual birds in the hallway. And the air was thick with the usual blend of teenage angst and cheap perfume. I remember thinking about what I was going to have for lunch, stressing about an upcoming history test, and mentally rehearsing a conversation I wanted to have with a certain someone. The mundane details of everyday life, the things that usually occupied my thoughts, seemed so important then, so all-consuming. Little did I know that within a few short hours, those concerns would fade into insignificance, replaced by a much more pressing and terrifying reality. It was a Tuesday, I believe, or perhaps a Wednesday. The specific day doesn't really matter except to mark the before and after, the point at which everything changed. Lost in the noise and routine of teenage life, the cacophony of slamming lockers, chattering voices, and the ever-present drone of the school bell created a constant hum, a background noise that I had become so accustomed to that I barely even noticed it anymore. I was just another face in the crowd, swept along by the current of teenage energy and hormones. I was trying to navigate the crowded hallways, dodging backpacks and weaving through groups of friends, all while simultaneously trying to remember my locker combination and mentally prepare for my next class. It was a sensory overload, a chaotic symphony of sights and sounds that was both exhilarating and exhausting. I was so caught up in the moment, so focused on the immediate demands of my daily routine, that I was completely oblivious to the storm that was brewing within me. Suddenly, a strange warmth spread through me, starting in my chest and radiating outwards like a slow-motion explosion. It wasn't an unpleasant warmth, not at first. It was more like a comforting hug, a gentle embrace that seemed to soothe my anxieties and calm my racing thoughts. But then, the warmth intensified, becoming almost unbearable, like a fever burning from the inside out. My heart started to race, pounding in my chest like a trapped bird, and my breath came in short, shallow gasps. I felt a tingling sensation in my fingertips and toes, and my vision started to blur around the edges. It was as if my body was suddenly overheating, struggling to maintain its equilibrium. I remember thinking, this isn't right, something is terribly wrong. And the world blurred. The once sharp edges of reality softened and dissolved, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The faces of my classmates became indistinct blobs, their voices fading into a muffled drone. The hallway seemed to stretch and warp, the walls closing in on me, the floor tilting precariously beneath my feet. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and my head started to spin. It was like being trapped inside a kaleidoscope, the world fragmenting and rearranging itself into a dizzying, disorienting mess. I tried to focus on something, anything, to anchor myself to reality, but it was no use. The world was spinning out of control, and I was losing my grip. My knees buckled, and I collapsed, crumpling to the floor like a discarded rag doll. It wasn't a dramatic, theatrical fall, not like in the movies. There was no graceful swooning or artful arrangement of limbs. It was just a sudden, unceremonious descent, a surrender to gravity. My legs simply gave way, unable to support my weight any longer. I remember the feeling of the cold, hard tile against my cheek, the rough texture scraping against my skin. I remember the surprised gasps and shouts of the people around me, their voices echoing in my ears. And then, everything went black. No warning, no gradual fading, no preliminary dizziness that would have allowed me to brace myself. It was a sudden, unexpected plunge into darkness, a complete and utter loss of control. One moment I was standing, however unsteadily, and the next I was on the floor, unconscious. There had been no flashing lights, no ringing in my ears, no premonition of impending doom, just a sudden, inexplicable blackout. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, plunging me into a void of nothingness. No pain, no struggle, no fear, just a peaceful, painless oblivion. It was a strange and unsettling experience to simply cease to exist, even for a brief moment. There were no dreams, no visions, no sense of time passing, just a complete and utter absence of consciousness. It was like being erased, wiped clean from the slate of existence. And in a way, it was almost peaceful, a temporary escape from the anxieties and pressures of everyday life, a brief respite from the constant demands of being. Just darkness, a vast, empty, infinite darkness, a darkness that swallowed me whole, erasing my thoughts, my memories, my very sense of self. It was a darkness that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Terrifying because it represented the ultimate unknown, the void that awaits us all. Comforting because it offered a temporary escape from the burdens of consciousness. In that darkness, there was no pain, no suffering, no fear, just a pure, unadulterated nothingness. When I opened my eyes, it was like emerging from a deep, dreamless sleep. The transition was gradual, a slow and hesitant return to consciousness. I was on the floor, the cold tile pressing against my cheek. The world swam back into focus slowly, blurry at first, then gradually sharpening into recognizable shapes and forms. Surrounded by worried faces and muffled voices, their expressions a mixture of concern and confusion. I could hear snippets of conversations, fragments of sentences that didn't quite make sense. She just collapsed. Did anyone see what happened? Is she okay? Their voices seemed distant and distorted, as if I were listening to them through a thick layer of cotton. Confusion and fear gripped me, a cold, clammy hand squeezing my heart. I felt disoriented and vulnerable, like a newborn animal struggling to find its footing. What had just happened? Where was I? Why was everyone staring at me? The questions swirled in my mind, a chaotic jumble of thoughts and emotions. I felt like I had woken up in a foreign land, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and strange customs. That first faint was more than a fluke, more than just a momentary lapse in consciousness. It was a harbinger of things to come, a sign that something was fundamentally wrong. It was a warning, a flashing red light on the dashboard of my life, signaling that I was heading down a dangerous path. But at the time, I didn't fully understand the significance of that warning. I dismissed it as a one-time event, a random glitch in the system. My body, once reliable, had become a stranger, an unpredictable and untrustworthy vessel. It was as if I had suddenly been transported into someone else's body, a body that I didn't recognize and couldn't control. Others dismissed it as dehydration, low blood sugar, or just teenage drama. "You're probably just stressed," they said. "You need to drink more water. Get some rest." Their words were well-intentioned, but they offered little comfort. But I knew it was something deeper, something more profound than a simple case of dehydration. I could feel it in my bones, a deep-seated intuition that something was seriously wrong. It was the first tremor of an earthquake that would reshape my life, a subtle but significant shift in the tectonic plates of my existence. In the days that followed, I lived in a state of heightened awareness, constantly on edge, waiting for the next shoe to drop. I became hyper-aware of every heartbeat, every flutter, every skipped beat, listening intently for any sign of impending doom. Every wobble, every moment of dizziness, every fleeting sensation of unsteadiness. The world felt unstable, like I was walking on shifting sands, never quite sure of my footing. And a quiet dread settled in, a persistent undercurrent of anxiety that colored every aspect of my life. This wasn't just a physical event, it was a psychological trauma, a deep wound that would take years to heal. It shattered my trust in my own body, leaving me feeling vulnerable and exposed. I was left with a void of uncertainty and fear, a gaping hole where my sense of security used to be. My life had changed in an instant, irrevocably altered by that single terrifying event, and nothing felt safe anymore. The world had become a dangerous and unpredictable place, and I was no longer sure that I could navigate it on my own. The illusion of control had been shattered, and I was left to grapple with the unsettling reality of my own vulnerability. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. A fleeting dizziness here, a momentary lapse in energy there. I dismissed them as mere blips, the kind everyone experiences from time to time. Perhaps I was just pushing myself too hard, burning the candle at both ends with school, extracurricular activities, and the usual teenage social whirl. But then, the blips became more frequent, more intense. The dizziness lingered, morphing into full-blown fainting spells that left me disoriented and shaken. These episodes were terrifying, unpredictable, and utterly disruptive. They could strike anywhere, anytime in the middle of class, during a casual conversation with friends, even while simply walking down the street. The fear of the next episode became a constant companion, a shadow lurking in the background of every moment. The fainting spells multiplied, becoming a regular, unwelcome feature of my life. They were no longer isolated incidents, but a recurring pattern, a clear signal that something was profoundly wrong. And as the fainting spells intensified, new symptoms followed, an insidious cascade of ailments that seemed to have no rhyme or reason. It was as if my body was turning against me, unleashing a torrent of inexplicable malfunctions. My heart raced while I sat still, pounding in my chest like a trapped bird desperate to escape. It was a relentless, unnerving sensation, as if I had just run a marathon without moving a muscle. This wasn't the healthy, vigorous thumping of a body in motion. It was a frantic, erratic rhythm that left me breathless and anxious. The racing heart was often accompanied by palpitations, those unsettling skips and flutters that made me acutely aware of the delicate machinery within my chest. It was a constant reminder that something was amiss, that my body was no longer functioning as it should. And fatigue weighed me down, an all-encompassing weariness that seeped into my bones and stole my energy. It wasn't the normal tiredness that comes after a long day. It was a profound, debilitating exhaustion that no amount of sleep could alleviate. Every task, no matter how small, felt like climbing a mountain. Getting out of bed in the morning became a monumental effort, and even simple activities like showering or brushing my teeth left me drained and depleted. The fatigue was a constant drag, a heavy anchor that kept me from participating in life. Joints ached and dislocated easily, betraying the promise of youthful resilience. What once felt strong and reliable now felt loose and unstable. Sharp, stabbing pains shot through my knees, elbows, and wrists, making even the simplest movements excruciating. My joints seemed to have a mind of their own, popping and clicking with every step, threatening to dislocate at any moment. It was a constant battle against my own body, a struggle to maintain stability and avoid the searing pain of a subluxation. Simple tasks became mountains, insurmountable obstacles that loomed large in my daily life. Things that I had once taken for granted, opening a jar, carrying a bag of groceries, even turning a doorknob, now required Herculean effort and often resulted in pain and frustration. My hands, once nimble and capable, became clumsy and unreliable. My arms and legs, once strong and agile, felt heavy and weak. The simplest chores became agonizing ordeals, reminders of my body's limitations and my growing dependence on others. My world shrank, constricted by the ever-tightening boundaries of my physical limitations. The vast, vibrant landscape of possibilities that had once stretched before me began to recede, replaced by the confines of my home, my bed, my illness, defined by what my body allowed, or more accurately, what it allowed. Each day became a careful calculation, a constant assessment of my energy levels and pain thresholds. I learned to ration my strength, to prioritize essential tasks and forego activities that would inevitably lead to a flare-up. My life became a series of compromises, a constant negotiation between my desires and my body's limitations. School became a gamble, a high-stakes game of chance where the odds were often stacked against me. Would I be able to make it through the day without collapsing from exhaustion? Would the pain in my joints become unbearable, forcing me to retreat to the nurse's office? Would I make it through the day? Each morning, I would steel myself for the challenge, pushing aside the fear and uncertainty and hoping for the best. But more often than not, my body would betray me, forcing me to cut classes, miss important lectures, and fall further and further behind. My grades fell, plummeting from their once respectable heights to a dismal, disheartening low. The academic success that I had always taken for granted began to slip through my fingers, replaced by a growing sense of failure and inadequacy. And teachers grew frustrated, their patience wearing thin as I struggled to keep up with the workload. They couldn't understand why I was suddenly underperforming, why I was missing so many classes, why I seemed so distracted and withdrawn. Some were sympathetic, offering extra help and understanding. But others were less forgiving, viewing my struggles as a lack of effort or motivation. Friendships faded as I withdrew, retreating into myself to cope with the pain and exhaustion. The social life that had once been so vibrant and fulfilling began to wither, replaced by a growing sense of isolation and loneliness. Unable to keep up with the demands of teenage life, parties, movies, and casual hangouts became distant memories, replaced by doctor's appointments, physical therapy sessions, and endless hours spent resting in bed. My friends, bless their hearts, tried to understand, But it was difficult for them to grasp the reality of my daily struggles. They couldn't comprehend the constant pain, the debilitating fatigue, the invisible limitations that governed my life. My parents were overwhelmed, struggling to navigate the complex and confusing world of chronic illness. They watched helplessly as their vibrant, energetic daughter slowly faded, replaced by a shadow of her former self, shuttling me from doctor to doctor, seeking answers and solutions that seemed perpetually out of reach. We visited specialists of every kind: neurologists, cardiologists, rheumatologists, immunologists, each offering their own theories and treatments, but none able to provide a definitive diagnosis or a lasting cure. The financial and emotional toll grew, placing an immense strain on our family. The mounting medical bills, the endless paperwork, the constant uncertainty, it all took its toll, straining our family, testing the bonds of love and loyalty. There were moments of frustration, of anger, of despair, but through it all, my parents remained my unwavering advocates, my constant source of support and encouragement. The invisible nature of my illness, the fact that I often looked perfectly healthy on the outside, made it even more difficult for others to understand. People would say, "But you look fine," or "You're too young to be sick," created distance and misunderstanding, leaving me feeling isolated and alone. It was as if I was living in two separate realities, the one that everyone else saw, where I appeared to be a normal, healthy young woman, and the one that I experienced internally, where I was constantly battling pain, fatigue, and a host of other debilitating symptoms. I gave up sports, the activities that had once brought me so much joy and fulfillment. The physical demands were simply too great, the risk of injury too high. Dancing, the art form that had been my passion since childhood. The graceful movements, the intricate steps, the sheer physical exertion, it was all beyond my reach. Even long walks, the simple pleasure of exploring the world on foot. My legs would ache, my joints would swell, and my energy would quickly deplete, leaving me stranded and exhausted. Everyday pleasures became risks, potential triggers for a flare-up of symptoms. I had to learn to be constantly vigilant, to anticipate potential dangers, to weigh the potential rewards against the inevitable consequences. A hot shower, once a soothing and relaxing ritual, now threatened to send my heart racing and my blood pressure plummeting. A big meal, once a source of enjoyment and social connection, now loomed as a potential source of digestive distress and debilitating fatigue. I felt trapped in a body that betrayed me, a vessel that had turned against its inhabitant. It was a constant battle against my own flesh and blood, a struggle to regain control over a body that seemed determined to self-destruct. Grieving the future I'd imagined, the life that I had always dreamed of. The career I had planned, the travels I had envisioned, the family I had hoped to have, all of it seemed to slip further and further away, replaced by a bleak and uncertain horizon. The world outside moved on, oblivious to my struggles, indifferent to my pain. People rushed by, caught up in their own lives, their own ambitions, their own dramas. While I watched from behind glass, a silent observer of a life that I could no longer fully participate in. I felt like an outsider, a ghost haunting the edges of society, forever separated from the vibrant, bustling world that lay just beyond my reach. I was a young woman living in the body of someone much older, burdened by the limitations and ailments of a person twice my age. My youth, my vitality, my sense of invincibility, all of it had been stolen by this insidious illness. My life was on pause, suspended in a state of perpetual uncertainty. The future stretched before me, a vast and daunting expanse filled with unanswered questions and unknown challenges. And I was left behind, stranded on the sidelines while the world continued to spin. The feeling of being left behind was a constant ache, a dull, throbbing pain that never quite went away. I longed to rejoin the flow of life, to participate fully in the experiences that my peers were enjoying. But for now, I was trapped in a holding pattern, waiting for a breakthrough, a cure, a glimmer of hope that would allow me to reclaim my life. The medical system, once a beacon of hope and healing, slowly transformed into a bewildering labyrinth of confusion and dismissal. What started as a search for answers became a frustrating journey through endless corridors of uncertainty. Each visit felt like entering a new level of a complex game, with the rules constantly changing and the objective remaining elusive. The once clear path to wellness was now obscured by a dense fog of medical jargon, conflicting opinions, and unanswered questions. The weight of this uncertainty began to take its toll, adding emotional distress to the already existing physical ailments. Specialist after specialist offered theories, each one more perplexing than the last. They poked, prodded, and questioned, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and skepticism. Each doctor seemed to focus on a different piece of the puzzle, without ever quite grasping the whole picture. One suggested a rare autoimmune disorder, another pointed to a possible hormonal imbalance, and yet another dismissed the symptoms as merely psychosomatic. The sheer volume of information became overwhelming, leaving me feeling lost in a sea of medical possibilities. But no answers. Test after test came back negative, further deepening the mystery. Each negative result felt like a punch to the gut, a confirmation that I was no closer to understanding what was happening to my body. The doctors, too, seemed increasingly frustrated, their initial enthusiasm replaced by a weary resignation. They ran out of ideas, out of tests, and ultimately, out of empathy. I was left standing there, empty-handed, with nothing but a growing sense of despair. Anxiety, conversion disorder, the go-to diagnoses when nothing else made sense. The medical establishment, unable to find a physical cause for my suffering, began to attribute it to psychological factors. They suggested that my physical symptoms were merely manifestations of underlying emotional distress, a way for my mind to cope with unresolved trauma. The idea that my pain was all in my head was not only invalidating but also deeply insulting. My symptoms were blamed on my mind. The doctors, with their limited understanding of complex and often misunderstood conditions, readily dismissed my concerns as products of my own imagination. They seemed to believe that if they couldn't find a physical explanation, then the problem must be psychological. This dismissive attitude not only delayed my diagnosis but also caused significant emotional harm. It made me question my own sanity, wonder if I was indeed making it all up. Each appointment was a performance, a carefully orchestrated attempt to convince the medical professionals that my suffering was real. I meticulously documented my symptoms, rehearsed my explanations, and tried to present myself as a rational and credible patient. I knew that if I showed any signs of emotional distress, my concerns would be immediately dismissed as anxiety-related. The pressure to perform was immense, and it added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation, hoping to be believed. I pleaded with doctors, begged them to listen, to truly hear what I was saying. I described my symptoms in excruciating detail, hoping that something, anything, would resonate with them. I brought medical records, research articles, and personal anecdotes, all in an effort to validate my experience. But often, my efforts were met with blank stares, polite nods, and ultimately, the same dismissive diagnoses. The label of anxious young woman colored every interaction, casting a shadow of doubt over my credibility. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy, a way for doctors to dismiss my concerns without truly investigating the underlying cause. The stereotype of the hysterical female patient loomed large, preventing me from being taken seriously. My age and gender became obstacles, hindering my access to proper medical care. I began to doubt my own reality, questioning whether my symptoms were truly as severe as I perceived them to be. The constant gaslighting from medical professionals eroded my confidence and made me question my own sanity. I started to wonder if I was exaggerating my pain, if I was being overly sensitive, if I was simply imagining things. The line between reality and perception blurred, leaving me feeling lost and disoriented. Without a diagnosis, I was stuck in limbo, a medical purgatory where I was neither sick enough to warrant treatment nor healthy enough to live a normal life. I was trapped in a cycle of endless appointments, inconclusive tests, and unfulfilled promises. My life was on hold, suspended in a state of uncertainty. I couldn't plan for the future, couldn't pursue my goals, couldn't even make simple decisions without considering the impact on my health. No treatment, no explanation. I was left to navigate my illness on my own, without the guidance or support of the medical community. I became my own doctor, my own researcher, my own advocate. I spent countless hours poring over medical journals, online forums, and patient support groups, desperately seeking answers. But without a proper diagnosis, my efforts felt futile, like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Years passed in this cycle of hope and disappointment, each one marked by countless medical appointments, failed treatments, and shattered dreams. The seasons changed, but my condition remained the same. I watched as my friends and peers moved on with their lives, pursuing careers, starting families, and achieving their goals. Meanwhile, I was stuck in a perpetual state of illness, my life defined by pain, fatigue, and uncertainty. Finally, after relentless self-advocacy, after years of fighting to be heard, After countless hours of research and self-education, I began to connect the dots myself. I stumbled upon articles in online communities that described my symptoms with uncanny accuracy. I learned about rare and often misunderstood conditions that could explain my constellation of health problems. Armed with this new knowledge, I sought out specialists who were familiar with these conditions and willing to listen to my concerns. I was diagnosed with POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, a condition that affects blood flow and causes a range of debilitating symptoms. Finally, a name for the racing heart, the dizziness, the fatigue that had plagued me for so long. EDS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a connective tissue disorder that explained my hypermobility, my chronic pain, and my fragile skin. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place. And MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome, a condition that causes my mast cells to release excessive amounts of histamine, leading to a wide range of allergic-like reactions. It was a medical breakthrough, a moment of validation that I had been right all along. Relief came, a wave of validation washing over me. The years of doubt, the gaslighting, the dismissals, all of it faded away in the face of this long-awaited confirmation. I finally had a name for my suffering, a reason for my pain. But so did the scars of years spent unheard, the emotional wounds inflicted by a medical system that had failed to listen. The trauma of being dismissed, of being told that my pain was all in my head, left deep scars that would take time to heal. The fight for a diagnosis was over. The battle to be believed had finally been won. I held the diagnosis papers in my hands, a tangible symbol of my victory. But a new battle had just begun, the fight for treatment, for management, for a better quality of life. The diagnosis was just the first step on a long and arduous journey. Now, I had to learn how to live with these conditions, how to manage my symptoms, and how to advocate for my needs in a medical system that was still largely unfamiliar with these disorders. The road ahead would be challenging, but I was no longer alone. I had a diagnosis, a community, and a newfound sense of hope. Living with an invisible illness is a heavy burden. I looked healthy, but inside was chaos. Constantly justifying my limitations was exhausting. The disbelief from others left me isolated and alone. My mental health suffered. Anxiety and depression took root. Family life fractured under the strain. My illness became a weapon in a painful custody battle. I was portrayed as unreliable, my suffering dismissed. I felt abandoned by the systems meant to protect me. In this darkness, I realized I had to become my own advocate. If I was to survive, I had to fight for myself. Out of despair, a new purpose emerged. I dove into medical research, determined to understand my illnesses. Knowledge became my lifeline, restoring a sense of control. I decided to pursue medicine, not despite my illness, but because of it. Sharing my story online, I found a community of others like me. Our shared struggles revealed a systemic failure in healthcare. Advocacy became my mission, to fight for better care and understanding. My pain became the foundation for something constructive. I was no longer just a patient, I was a voice for the voiceless. My journey of suffering was transforming into a mission for justice. My advocacy moved beyond forums and research. I sought accountability for the harm I'd endured, not just for myself, but for others. Legal action against medical institutions was daunting and draining. The system resisted, protecting itself over patients. I reported neglect to authorities, hoping to spark change. Bureaucracy and red tape threatened to silence me, but every setback fueled my resolve. This fight became about principle, demanding dignity for all patients. Even without all the victories I wanted, reclaiming my power mattered. I refused to be a silent victim. My story, and others, deserve to be heard. Chronic illness has shaped me, but it hasn't broken me. I've built a new life, dedicated to advocacy and healing. My promise is to turn pain into hope for others. I'm committed to writing, demystifying complex illnesses and empowering patients. I want to foster empathy in children, teaching kindness toward all differences. My advocacy extends to all marginalized communities. I pledge to amplify voices and support those pushed to the fringes. My story is one of resilience, not tragedy. To anyone lost in the fog of illness, you are not alone. Together we can build a future of empathy, justice, and hope.